Welcome back to Washington Watch. My name is Joseph Backholm, sitting in for Tony today. We've spent a lot of time today talking about the crisis in Afghanistan, how it's being received in the U.S. by our country's veterans, as well as by persecuted believers in Afghanistan. But how should we in the U.S. be thinking about this crisis? Joining me now to talk about all of it is Dr. Albert Mohler, president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, the author of The Gathering Storm, Secularism, Culture, and the Church, and also the host of one of the best podcasts in America, The Briefing. Dr. Mohler, thanks for joining us.
It's great to be with you. Thank you.
Well, there's a lot of layers here that I want to discuss with you, and I know you're not a political prognosticator necessarily by training, but I want to play some statements from President Biden, and then just get your thoughts on how he's doing in all of this.
We'll not conduct a hasty rush to the exit. We'll do it responsibly, deliberately, and safely.
Is a Taliban takeover of Afghanistan now inevitable?
No, it is not.
Do you see any parallels between this withdrawal and what happened in Vietnam, with some people feeling...
None whatsoever. Zero. There's going to be no circumstance where you see people being lifted off the roof of an embassy of the United States from Afghanistan. It is not at all comfortable. Likelihood there's going to be the Taliban overrunning everything and owning the whole country is highly unlikely.
Don't you bear some responsibility for the outcome if the Taliban ends up back in control and women end up losing the rights?
No, I don't. Do I bear responsibility? Zero responsibility.
So we know that President Biden, his position has changed over time recently, in large part because the facts have changed. How would you assess how he's doing, how he's handling this situation?
I think this is a national humiliation for the United States. I think it is an insult to the very values for which this nation stands and the loyalties that are required for this nation to thrive and be respected in the larger world. There's a sense in which, if you even use the phrase government in Afghanistan, is something of an oxymoron. Afghanistan is not a nation in the sense so many other nations are. It's a territory with many rival tribalisms. But there was nothing new on the ground that in any sense justified the United States just abandoning its responsibility, abandoning our allies, and with the humiliation of a plan that was so bad and so much in denial of reality that once again we had Americans fleeing off the rooftops of embassies, and now we've even lost the embassy. The American flag is down, and we have Americans stranded and American allies at grave risk. And the president bears responsibility, direct responsibility. He claimed it, by the way, made that clear as commander-in-chief before the withdrawal, assuring the American people that what did happen wouldn't happen. And now he has to live with his own words, but America has to live with the consequences.
I don't know if you had a chance to watch the statement that he made earlier today, but he essentially doubled down on it. He offered no apologies for what he has done and basically said this is the right thing. Maybe it's painful, but it was the right thing and necessary. Comparisons are being made, it seems, to President Carter, and those comparisons are generally not flattering. Do you think that's fair?
I think it's more than fair. And remember, this is the man that ran for president and once taking office, declared America is back. He was a foreign policy expert. It reminds me of the fact that Robert Gates, the former Secretary of Defense, once said that there are few men who have had more ideas about foreign policy than Joe Biden, but every one of them is wrong. And unfortunately, he learned all the wrong lessons in terms of foreign policy. America is humiliated. I mean, just consider our allies are so concerned that the British foreign minister, registered his concern. That's Britain. And then we are giving encouragement to our enemies. You've got the Communist Party in China putting out as many pictures as it can of this American humiliation. But it's the morality of it that I hate the most, with people whose lives. I mean, you've got pictures of people so desperate to get out because the Taliban will kill them because they were our allies, that they've gone into the wells of airplanes, and upon takeoff, some of them are falling out to their deaths. It's just hard for me to imagine how any administration of any party at any time can act as if what took place was the right decision. I don't think the American people will believe that for a moment.
And truly, from just a humanitarian perspective, it is heartbreaking to watch what's happening. And and even President Obama, in more colorful language than I will use, said that you should not overestimate or underestimate President Joe Biden's ability to screw things up. But why do you think he got it so wrong? Was this bad intelligence? Was there political pressure from somewhere to do this? Why did this happen this way?
I don't know any justification. It's clear the military. And one of the things to watch here is the fact that you have a newspaper as pro-Democrat as the New York Times on the front page, basically saying this is against all military advice. This was against all military intelligence. This was Joe Biden. And by the way, he started talking this way in 2010. So he's been thinking about this for a long time. And I don't know that I could possibly get into the calculus of his mind in doing this. But the reality is, he had every reason to know what would take place. The timing, if anything, is a testimony to how horrible the plan was. You had the president saying there's no chance there are going to be Americans, on the rooftop of an embassy needing to be rescued. No, actually, it's far worse than that. We have Americans who can't even now get to a non-existent embassy to get on the roof. This is a very sad thing. I say lamentably, when the president said America is back, I don't think America knew it meant back on the rooftops of a smoldering embassy.
Yeah, it is. I think you're right. It's actually worse than people imagine, because we have people who haven't even made it to the embassy. And sadly, this is likely to play out for a while. And we should all be concerned and in prayer for those who are affected. Now, do you think, and I want to pivot a little bit to the worldview components of this, as we as Christians, as we think about this. In the broadest sense, does God care what happens in Afghanistan with respect to the United States government?
Well, God will hold human beings, every single one of us, to full account morally. And collectively, we are organized, and I think not by accident, into nations. Government's one of God's good gifts, and thus it's moral because we're moral, and there will be an answer. There's an answer in history. There's a moral texture to the judgment that is meted out over history. Just ask the nations so exposed in their evil and imbecility in the 20th century. But the reality is that in worldview terms, the great moral issue here is that God cares about every single human being made in his image. And you're talking about a grave danger to human life. Now, I want to be clear that our understanding of sin also helps us to understand why things are as horrible as they are in Afghanistan and about to get worse. And so I am not suggesting that somehow the United States government failed in building a credible government there in Afghanistan. You can't build someone else's government. The people of Afghanistan don't think of themselves as a nation. There has never really been a credible government there. You can make the argument that the Taliban almost assuredly would have eventually gained control of Afghanistan territory, if for no other reason than they are more ruthless and more powerful than any other group of warlords. But to have this kind of immediate, reckless abandonment that leaves not only the people long-term in Afghanistan in the grips of the Taliban, but leaves America's own people and our allies at immediate risk, there's a grave moral issue there.
It's common to hear, and we've heard this from President Biden, saying that essentially it's no longer in our national interest to be in Afghanistan. And people on both sides of the political spectrum, I think, would agree with the fact that we can't be the world's police. The United States can't be everywhere. We can't send our military every time someone bad gets in power and does terrible things, because the world is big and we are limited. But the general principle here is it wrong from a Christian worldview perspective to value our own national interests, to look at the lives of Americans and say, I'm the president, it's my job to take care of Americans. It's terrible that things are happening to other people who, of course, are also image bearers. But how should we, through a worldview perspective, balance the lives of people who live in different places and in different countries?
Yeah, what a great question. And that means, as I say, that we have to begin with the basic biblical affirmation that every single human being, by the way, born and unborn, in every situation, every point of life, is an image bearer of God. the reality is the Bible also tells us that we kind of begin where we are. That's the Christian principle of subsidiarity. We begin by taking care of our own family because that's what's the first and foremost. And then, our own extended kin and our neighborhood and our community and yes, our nation. But the United States was not motivated in the situation in Afghanistan merely out of self-interest. The jihadist movement is not directed only against the United States. This wasn't just some kind of revenge or reprisal. If anything, it shows the idealism of the United States in spending 20 years of American blood and treasure trying to build a functioning society in Afghanistan because the vacuum simply breeds more jihadism and terrorism. But at the end of the day, there just is not the will on the part of a sufficient number of citizens in Afghanistan to build a functioning nation. The tribal identities are primary. By the way, that's a grave warning to any other nation, including the United States. That's one of the reasons why the left subverting American ideals and the very notion of America threatens to lend us over to that kind of tribalism. There is an American loyalty, an American patriotism. There is an American idealism that was humiliated here, but it's going to continue because the American people believe in those ideals. But yes, from a Christian worldview perspective, this is what's called Christian just war theory, the understanding that you sometimes have to use violence in a sinful world to stop violence or to resist it. And that's exactly what America has been doing. I mean, consider the people we've been fighting there. First of all, Al-Qaeda and then the Taliban. I mean, we are talking about jihadists who will do damage, not only in terms of terrorist attacks, as we saw in 9/11, 2001, but are already horrifyingly massacring and mistreating their own people. You've got women who now will not be educated, and yet worse than that, you have young girls who are being taken as wives of the conquering jihadist Taliban soldiers now. You have massacres of their political enemies. And so it's a Christian act at times to have to use violence to try to resist violence. The 20th century, if nothing else, must have taught us that lesson.
Earlier in the program, we talked to Congressman Mike Waltz from Florida, and he, in discussing kind of the longevity of our involvement in Afghanistan, he brought up the point that we're not at war with a nation, we're at war with an idea. And he made a comparison to communism and the Cold War, and that when you're at war with an idea, you have to make a long-term commitment, and that's not necessarily measured in years. Sometimes it's generations. Do you think that's a fair argument in a fair assessment of what we're dealing with terrorism?
I think it's a fair assessment, but I just want to make clear that the idea we're fighting when it comes to jihadism is an idea that's at least 14 centuries old. It is endemic to Islam, and it is following a Quranic logic. And so it does take a long-term commitment, but it's a long-term commitment that is really beyond what can be fixed in Afghanistan. And look, there are all kinds of things to consider here. You've got the funding of all these terrorist sources. You've got Middle Eastern petrostates that have been given aid and comfort, even while claiming to be American allies, and frankly, scared to death themselves of the same jihadist movement. There's a lot going on here. It is a battle of ideas, but it's also theological. It comes down to the fact that the West is based upon a Christian civilization. I'm not saying everyone's a Christian believer, but it's the basic structure of Christianity that gave birth to Western civilization, and this is a movement that is seeking to undo that everywhere. And it's not going to be a short battle. And I think in biblical terms, we should expect this is a battle that will continue until Jesus comes. But that means we bear responsibility.
You mentioned that this is a 14-century-old conflict. Do you think that means that this is not winnable?
Well, it isn't winnable in the sense of the fact that at the military level, you really can do very little to change hearts and minds. I will say, as a Christian, we're talking here about missions and evangelism. We're talking about the conflict between Christianity and Islam. We're talking about two rival faiths with two rival sets of truth claims and morality. And so you look at this and you recognize it's intractable insofar as our historical understanding and imagination must be. When you go back to the 7th century in order to understand how long this this battle has gone on. I mean, America's first major foreign policy issue and challenge after the Reformation was Islamic piracism. Coming from North Africa, the Barbary pirates. America has actually had a confrontation with jihadist Islam going back for almost as long as we've been a nation. It's not going to go away anytime soon. One of the big issues here is just the fact that Afghanistan is a part of that larger issue. If Afghanistan's not just a spot on planet Earth where these issues are limited. No, it's part of a far larger picture.
We've got about a minute left. How should parents be talking to their kids about what's on the news right now?
Well, it certainly helps us to remember, first of all, that God is sovereign and that human life matters and that we're moral creatures because God made us this way, and we are all to be held morally responsible. Joseph, I hope you'll let me say just one more thing, and that is this. This is not a failure of the American soldier. The American soldier fought nobly and accomplished keeping back the forces of mayhem from Afghanistan for 20 years, over 2,000 American lives lost. They did not fail. The American soldier and armed services did not fail here. This is a political failure.
I think that's a really good point. Dr. Albert Mohler, we really appreciate your time.